Hey everyone, and welcome to the Retro channel. Today we're going to do some very basic troubleshooting with some Commodore 64s. Now, the good thing about Commodore 64s is they're plentiful. There's a lot of repair guides on them. They're well documented. So generally they're pretty easy to troubleshoot. And it's something that I probably recommend for anyone interested in getting into retro repairs. Commodore 64 is definitely a good way to go. Now, I'm not going to be using any soldering irons. There's no oscilloscopes or diagnostic cartridges. We're keeping this very basic. I just want to cover a few of the first things that you should look at when you're trying to diagnose a Commodore 64, and potentially you can apply this to a lot of other things. But like I said, this is a good place to start. So today, all we've got is a basic multimeter, some 99% isopropyl alcohol, a toothbrush, Phillips head screwdriver, flathead screwdriver, and just another little flathead screwdriver. That is all we're going to be using. Obviously, you're going to need a Commodore 64 power supply and a cable to connect it to a display. I'm going to assume that you already have these, but if not, have a look on eBay. You should be able to find them fairly easily. So what we've got here is a nicely restored Commodore 64, which usually sits up there behind me, and we've got one that doesn't work, that's in horrid condition. So let's take a look at these. We'll start by just looking at, like I said, basic troubleshooting, and then we'll see if we can apply it to this one and see if we can repair this without using any fancy tools. All right, so let's start with the bread bin. We're not going to connect any power yet. We're going to jump straight in and open it up. So you'll find there's 3 screws across the bottom of the case that just need to come out. Put those aside, and it just lifts up from the front, just like that. So there's clips on the back. Sometimes they'll already be broken, but hopefully not. And the first thing we want to do is remove the keyboard connector. Now, I just sort of grab all the cables and just sort of wiggle it back and forth, and it should come out, and hopefully you don't bend any of the pins. The other thing to remove is the power LED. Now, this has actually got 3 pins, but only 2 wires, so it doesn't matter which way around you put this back in, it's going to work the same. The keyboard connector, on the other hand, is keyed, so you can't actually put it back in the wrong way, but obviously don't force it if it's not going in. Now, this might look a little bit different because there are some heat sinks on these chips. Generally, you're not going to have that. You might have an RF shield, which sometimes is just clipped over the cartridge port cover, and it's pretty easy just to remove that to reveal the board. Now, what we're going to do is connect the power supply, but before I do that, I'm going to make sure that the Commodore is turned off. So the switch should be in the down position, not the up position. So what we want to do is test the power supply to make sure that it's putting out the right voltages. Now, you can do this without connecting it to the Commodore 64. You've just got to try and probe these pins without shorting anything out, and that can be quite a challenge. You can alternatively put like a little bit of heat shrink tubing around the pins, but this is very easy for beginners doing it this way. So we're going to plug it in. The Commodore is not powered on. We're going to get our multimeter and set it to volts. So we've got our multimeter set to volts DC, and the Commodore is not powered on. The power supply is, and it's plugged in. Before we get too excited, I should mention this as well. A lot of these chips are very sensitive to static electricity, so if you build up a static charge and you zap somebody, it hurts them, but it kills these chips. So one of the ways to mitigate that without having a full ESD safe setup is just touch something metal like the RF shield cover or the cartridge port cover. That will pretty much just remove any buildup of static electricity. Obviously, if you go out and come back and you've been walking across carpet or whatever, you just want to touch something metal on the case, just to remove most of that static electricity before you go actually touching any chips. Now, back to testing the power supply. So for the DC side, I'm just going to put this probe just on top of this, or even on top of the cartridge port cover. Anywhere metal that's exposed is fine. This is just sort of convenient. And with the other probe, I'm going to go in and try and touch one of the bottom pins on the power supply connector. And you can see we're getting 5.17 volts. So either of those two bottom pins should give us the same readout, 5.17. For AC voltage, we're going to switch our multimeter to AC, and either probe, doesn't matter which way around these are, we're just going to touch them to the top two pins, like that. And we're getting 10.1 volts AC. So for the AC, you want somewhere between usually 9.5 up to 12 maximum. Preferably something around 10 is quite good. For the DC side of things, you want something between 5 and about 5.4. If it's over 5.4, you should definitely look at getting a new power supply, because these do fail and they'll send too much voltage into the Commodore 64, effectively killing multiple chips. For AC, 9.5 to 12, DC 5 to 5.4-ish. Now, one more thing before we turn this on, just make sure that there's nothing odd looking on the board, no corrosion, leaking capacitors. Usually it's pretty easy to tell if something looks off. Most of these are probably quite dusty, so you might have to just brush the dust off. One of the things you want to check is with chips that are in a socket, so they're not soldered directly onto the board, they actually sit in a socket that you can pull the chip out of. Just make sure that the little notches are facing the right way. So if you look under the chip, you can see on the silk screen marking, so all this white marking writing on the board, you can see that it actually dips around where that notch should be. So if any chips are socketed, just make sure they're in the correct orientation. Also double check that the SID is in U18. Sometimes the SID is up here, sometimes it's over here, and the PLA is in U17. A lot of the times these can get swapped around by somebody not paying attention, and in a standard machine they look very similar. So the 6581 should be in U18 and the PLA should be in U17. So if you're happy with how everything looks on the board, the chips appear to be in the right places and orientation, we can power it on. Now again, we're just going to check for voltage, and the easiest place to do that is on the other side of the board on the user port. So you'll see on the user port there is a gap here and a gap here. For our AC voltage, we can just touch either probe to the pins either side of that gap. Try that again. We're seeing 9.17 volts, which is about right. So we were getting 10 volts in, it gets dropped a little bit by things drawing current, and we're seeing 9 point something volts over here, which is perfectly fine. Anything from 9 to, 10 is probably okay. Switching over to DC, and the pins either side of this notch is what we want to look at, and we're getting 4.97. It's actually saying minus 4.97. That's just because I've got the probe switched around. Doesn't matter. So anywhere between about 4.9 to 5.2 is okay. If it's over, say, 5.3 or under 4.8, then you may have issues, and it could be a power supply, it could be something on the board. One other thing we can check for voltage is these voltage regulators. Now, on the most common revisions like this one, which is you'll see assembly number 250407 and 250425, both those boards are very similar. There is also to earlier revisions, which you'll notice are quite different because the capacitors here are laid out differently. But the 0407 and the 0425 are the most common, so that's usually what you're going to find. Now we want to measure these two voltage regulators. This is our 5-volt voltage regulator and our 12-volt. These feed the VIC chip and also the SID chip, so they're separate from everything else, and the power from these is derived from the AC input. So these are separate from the main DC power supply, just to mitigate any interference between what all these other chips are doing and the video and audio output. So to test these, we're just going to put our probe on this metal shield. You could also do it up here if you wanted to. And we're going to probe pin 2 of these voltage regulators, which is the one on the right hand side of them. Being careful not to slip and touch anything else. So we're seeing 5.03 volts out of that. It should be very close to 5 volts, so within about 1 or 2%. And same with this 12-volt voltage regulator. So pin 2 on this, we're seeing 11.9. So those voltages are perfectly fine. We've got good voltage over there. Everything seems to be okay. The other thing you can do is just a simple temperature test. So if you place your finger and make sure that you've discharged any static, place your finger on top of the chips and see what gets really hot. Now, usually the VIC chip, which is always on this side of the board, is the warmest. So you can use that as a sort of a guide. So if anything gets hotter than the VIC chip, chances are there's a problem. So that's usually the hottest. The SID and PLA tend to get quite warm, as does the CPU. But you can go around just putting your finger on all the chips for a couple of seconds. You'll know if something's not right because they tend to get really hot. Beyond that, there's not much else we can do. Say, for instance, you're missing voltages on these regulators. It could just be the fuse, which is quite simple. So if we send our multimeter to continuity mode or diode mode, it indicates that there's low resistance. So we know the fuse is still good. If it just said OL like this, we'd know that there was an issue with the fuse itself and you'd have to replace it with the same size, same rating fuse. There's not much else you can do with this basic multimeter. If you did pick up one that has is able to measure frequency, you can switch over to Hertz. We'll turn this back on. There are just a couple of simple ones that you can check. So again, I'm just going to put one probe here, and on the CPU, which is the 6510, it'll be labeled as U7 on the board. We can probe pin 39. So if you start from the top left corner, that's pin 1, down to pin 20. On the other side, pin 21 up to pin 40. So pin 39 is the second last one, and no doubt my hand is going to get in the way here, but if I just probe between that, 984.9 kilohertz. So that's the clock output from the CPU. So we know that there's a clock signal going around. You can do a similar thing with the VIC. So on this, you want pin 21, which will be the first pin on the bottom right of the VIC. And it should give us 17.73 megahertz. This is saying 17.72. That's coming from our crystal oscillator. So we know that there's a clock signal, and that's the main thing that you need to get everything else working. Without a clock signal, you won't get a video signal, not even a black screen. Chances are you'll just get no signal on your display when you actually connect the display to it. It's really about all I can show you with this board, but let's have a look at the other board, which is having issues, and I'll explain a few more things. One thing I forgot to mention, the VIC chip usually has a metal can over the top. Usually you can pop it open. Some of them are actually a solid piece and you have to desolder it, but generally you can open them up. They've just got a little shield over the top and it's just sort of held in by a couple of clips. So you should be able to just pop it open to reveal the VIC. All right, so this is the faulty machine. This type of case is usually referred to as the C64C. Same sort of deal. It usually will have 3 screws along the bottom. Sometimes there'll be a warranty seal here. To be honest, you may as well just get rid of it. You can actually buy new ones off eBay if you're really worried about it, but given you can buy replacement stickers, it sort of makes the whole point of having a sticker there invalid. So totally up to you. On some rare cases you'll have clips in these spots. I have not come across them yet, but apparently they do exist for, I think, really late revision C64C cases. So with those 3 screws out, this one's a little bit trickier to open. There are hidden clips around the front of the unit, around this sort of, where it sort of angles there. The best way to do it is to use your index finger to push down on the bottom part of the case on either side, and then with your other fingers lift up the front of the case. Again, you just want to tilt it back. There's clips at the back which may make a nice cracking sound when you open it up. In this case they didn't, and again they may break, but what can you do? Now for the C64C, you might see the long board. You'll know because the keyboard connector's up this end, or you'll have the short board and the keyboard connectors hidden underneath here. In this case we've got a long board, so again we're going to do the same thing. Disconnect the keyboard. We can't get to the LED connector yet. You can obviously pull it out of the case if you really want, but if you remove these 2 screws that hold the keyboard in place, you can get to that connector. And keep in mind they're metal screws going into these brackets, so they're different from the rest. The keyboard, you can lift it up a little bit at the back and then you just slide it backwards, so it's held in by these tabs at the front. And with that out of the way, you can remove that LED. Again, 3 pins, so it doesn't matter which way around you put this. This is more likely what you're going to see. So there's an RF shield. In this case, it's a metal one. Now, I usually throw these away because they don't really serve a purpose. But if you do that and you've got ones that have these little tongues that are sticking down, you will want to put heat sinks on top of the chips, at least the major ones. And we'll see that in a second. So let's just get this out of the way for now. It's pretty obvious. You'll see a bunch of screws. I think there's about 5 screws that hold this on. And that can just lift off, and try not to lose those screws, which I'm about to. Now, if you do want to throw this away, just remember to remove it from this keyboard mount, because you'll still need to put the keyboard mount back in order to put the keyboard back in. So this is more like what you'd normally see. The other machine, obviously I've done some work to it, so it's clean and it's got heat sinks. So this thermal paste, you'll probably want to replace either way, even if you do keep the original RF shield. Just clean that off with some alcohol, which we've got here, and reapply some thermal paste, preferably not the silver based stuff, so the non-conductive stuff, but totally up to you. Like I said, this is more what you're going to see. So only the VIC and the SID are in a socket, and you'll notice the SID is up here on this revision, whereas before it was down here. So that's the PLA, that's our SID. So apart from the short boards, which we'll also have a look at in a minute, the SID is always going to say 6581 on it, so you always know what that chip is. So once again, what we're going to do is connect power, make sure it's switched off. And we know that our power supply is putting out the right voltage. So if I were, for example, to do this, again, we're going to see that it's not plugged in properly and you can't see the multimeter. All right, I'll try and find a spot that's not rusted. So again, poking at those pins, we're seeing that 5.17 volts, and likewise the 2 pins on the top will show us our AC voltage, which is now at 9.9. Nothing unusual there. Powering on, again, we're going to go over to the user port, and these 2 pins around the left-hand notch are showing us 9.3 volts AC. Switching to DC, these 2 pins should show us 5 volts, but they are not. And that's possibly why this machine isn't working. So when I powered this on and plugged it into a display, I was getting a black screen. So there was a signal being put out by the VIC chip, but nothing else was happening. Now, as I mentioned before, the VIC is powered from these voltage regulators from the AC side of the power supply. Everything else is powered from that DC side, including what we would normally see here. So the AC side is working because we're getting a signal out. And we can confirm that by just looking at these voltage regulators again. So 4.94 volts, I've got the probe switched around, so it's saying minus, but yeah, 12.17, 4.94, so 12 and 5, the VIC is working, and the crystal is working because it's outputting a video signal. Once again, we can see that on pin 21, which will be this one back here, 17.72 megahertz. Now, for example, if we look at the CPU at pin 39, we're probably not going to see anything at all. We're still getting 985 kilohertz, so maybe that's not a foolproof test. There you go. Let's take a look at other places where you might find that 5 volts. Maybe it's just not making it to the user port. Maybe it's not making it anywhere at all. So on pin 6 of the CPU, we should see our 5 volts. And we're seeing 3.3 and dropping maybe. So something is definitely off here. Let's go back and look at heat. I don't want to get my hand covered in this crap, but yes, the VIC is definitely warm. PLA is cold. The SID's slightly warm, which makes sense. Makes sense that those two would be slightly warm. Everything else is cold. So there doesn't seem to be a chip that's shorted that's pulling down this voltage. Let's work our way back a little bit, back to the switch, and just see if the voltage is present there. So it's still powered on. The bottom pin of the switch, the one that's closest towards you, so this pin down here is where our DC voltage goes into the switch, so that should always have 5 volts on it, which it does. The next pin up from that, so the one in the middle, closest towards you again, is where the output DC voltage should be. And again, we're seeing that 3.1 volts. So something's definitely amiss. Let's just flick it off, flick it on again. Now we're seeing 4.3 volts. And now, yeah, the voltages are all over the place. I'm just going to sort of hook that in there, just so I can get a free hand. Might just jiggle around the switch. We're up to 4 volts. So there's 5 volts going into the switch, but there's only 3 volts coming out. But I'm not sure if that's being pulled down by something afterwards or if it's internal to the switch and there's a potential fault there. These do go bad fairly often, so it's not out of the question. What I might do, disconnect the power, go back to our resistance measurement, and we'll just try and hook these. So one probe on each, the bottom and the middle leg of this switch, the one's closest to me. I'm just going to flick it on, and I'm reading 65 ohms from the switch. You should basically read 0 or point something, less than an ohm. Now I'm getting 100 and something. So it would appear, in fact, I'm certain there is an issue with this switch. That's a little bit tricky. It's usually not something you can fix without a soldering iron, but I guess we can go for broke. So I'm going to remove the rest of the board. There's just a few more screws around the edges of the board. They'll be pretty obvious. You can't really miss them. That should be it, yep. And you just got to sort of work it around that RF plug and the switches, or the switcher. So there's our switch. Yeah, really, there's the bottom RF shield, which has been clipped off. Usually these are soldered with these tabs, but looks like this one's been clipped off, which is kind of convenient. Again, I don't keep those anyway. So with the switch, there's not a huge lot we can do. If you've got your isopropyl alcohol, you could attempt to just spray some in there and sort of work it in. From what I've found, these switches have a small amount of grease near the contacts, I guess just so they don't bind up. So spraying alcohol in there could disrupt that. So it's not guaranteed to work, and yeah, it could make it worse. But if you have a soldering iron, or if you decide to get a bit more serious, pick up soldering iron and remove the whole switch, and you can actually open these up. There's little tabs on either side that keep it in one piece, and you can open it up, clean it out properly. But let's just see if a little bit of alcohol getting worked through will make any difference. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. We're still on continuity. Let's just remove that. Let's just do the continuity test first. So probing here. So that's with the switch off. So it's reading mega ohms. Don't worry about that. Switch is on. 0 ohms. So that's what we want to see. So it looks like, at least for now, our switch is working again. Yep, 0 ohms. In which case, hopefully the whole system now works. There's one way to find out. We'll use the old phone camera. All right, here we go. On. Boom. Fantastic. So, from black screen to seemingly fully working with just a multimeter, that's pretty good. Obviously, you're not going to get that lucky every time. Some of the other things you can try if you're still having issues is popping out any socketed chips, especially the SID and the VIC. Once again, make sure you're not charged up with static electricity, and gently sort of lever these out. You don't want to lift them all the way up from one side. You just want to pop open one side, pop out the other side, lift it up, and you can inspect the pins. On this case there is a bit of corrosion around them. Again, alcohol, just spray it liberally, and you can just sort of scrub those with a toothbrush. That should get most of the crud and oxidization off the pins. Because sometimes if there's a bad contact with the socket, and Commodore tended to use a lot of very cheap, nasty sockets, if there's not perfect contact, then you might end up with a black screen or whatever other issues. So quick scrub of the pins, and you can also give the socket a bit of a scrub too. That's about it. Because it's 99% alcohol, it'll pretty much dry almost straight away. You don't have to worry about trying to wipe it up or anything. Likewise, you can do the same with the Vic. You can actually leave the SID out and the machine will still boot. You can even take out the CIAs if they're socketed. The machine will still boot. You just won't have a cursor. If you take out the basic ROM, you'll just get a blue screen with the light blue border. If you take out the character ROM, you'll get an almost basic screen, except all the characters will be all flickery and messed up. It's a good way, if they are socketed, of just ruling those chips out. So if there's an issue with the chip itself, it may stop the system from booting, so it won't do anything. You'll just get a black screen. And once you pull that chip out, it may boot up. You're just not going to have the functionality of whatever that chip is supposed to do. So that's worth a try. Pretty much everything else, so everything else that I didn't mention needs to be in the machine. Really, you can only boot without the CIAs, the basic, the character, or the SID, and even then you're only going to get potentially jumbled up screen, but it could be better than getting a black screen, and it may help you rule out particular issues. So that's good for this one. If you needed to take it further, the next thing I would pick up would be the diagnostic and dead test harness. That can also reveal a lot of issues, and at least it might narrow it down to a particular chip or maybe a RAM IC or something. But always start with the multimeter tests. That's the most basic thing. And even if you jump online and you ask for help, at least you can say, I've tested this with the multimeter. So gives other people trying to help you out a starting point. Oh, one other thing, when you're putting these screws back in, just turn them counterclockwise, just until you feel it sort of drop into the original threads when you're screwing back into plastic. If you don't manage to get it in the original threads, you'll end up cutting a new thread with the screw, and then it won't stay in properly anymore. It will basically strip the old thread, and then you'll have screws falling out. Alright, one more faulty one. It also powers up to a black screen, and you can see this did have the warranty seal that somebody's moved over. I just take that off and throw it away anyway. Like I said, you can buy those brand new, so they don't really mean anything. So here we can see the power LED is now up the top corner of the case, around where the keyboard connector was. So that's a giveaway that this is the short board, the 250469. Once again, we still have to remove these keyboard screws in order to get the keyboard out of the way. And we lift that out. And the keyboard connector's over here. Again, it's keyed, so you can only put it back one way. And this has got a cardboard RF shield. So as I was saying, these will usually be clipped around the cartridge port. I think I'm going to have to remove these little keyboard mounts to actually get it out of the way. Right, and that's why they call it a short board, because it's short. The other one extends almost the full length of the case. Well, at least to these screw posts. So things pretty different because a lot of these chips now just run off 5 volts. So there's a lot less componentry in the power supply, and a lot of stuff has been consolidated into this, which is called the Super PLA. Well, let's just plug it in and we'll see what happens here. All right, machine's turned off. We're set to DC. We'll turn it on, find a metal place, and we'll look at that middle pin of the switch. In this case, we are getting 5 volts. So happy that the switch is working. We can look at the user port. We're seeing 5 volts there. Switch to AC, and on the other side of the user port, we're seeing 1 volt. Yep, 1 volt. That's not right. Right, so I've just taken the board out of the case to make things a little bit easier. Let's have a look at what happens with these AC voltages. So obviously they come in, they go through the switch, through the fuse, well at least one side does, and into this bridge rectifier, which converts things from AC to DC, and then through some of these larger filter caps. The SID is actually powered from the AC coming in, but obviously converted to DC. The easiest place to look for this is on the SID, because it's on pin 28, so it's the very last pin on the top right. And yeah, we're seeing, it is switched on, we're seeing 130 millivolts. So that is obviously not correct. Let's just power it off. I can see that the fuse looks intact, but we'll just test it again. That looks fine. So again, it could be an issue with the switch, obviously just on the other side. So before we had an issue with the side that switched the DC input, this time it may well be the side that switches the AC input. Now, it's a little bit hard to get probes in between here to these 2 pins, so we're going to do it from the other side of the board. And for the AC, it should be these 2 pins towards the top here. So these were our DC, this side is our AC. So at the moment, there shouldn't be any continuity. And if we flick the switch on, obviously with no power connected, we should see a short, but instead we're seeing 700 ohms resistance. That should be 0 between those 2. So once again, this might be a simple one and could just be the switch. Let's just try the old trick of spraying some alcohol in there. Like I said before, you would actually want to probably desolder this switch so you can open it up and clean it out properly, or replace it. But no soldering irons today, so I'm going to work some of that alcohol through there, spray in a little bit more. Like I said, this stuff dries quite quickly, so it's not going to be a big deal. Okay, before we plug it in, let's just test that again. Don't know why I turned the multimeter off, but anyway. You can see some of this flux from the bottom of the switches coming off the board. You don't have to worry too much about that. I mean, you can clean it up if you want. So switch is on, and we're now seeing 0 ohms across the AC side and 0 ohms across the DC side. So in theory, this should now be working. I was actually kind of hoping that it would be something else on the board, and who knows, it might still fail when we connect the display, but there's only one way to find out. Right, just for reference, we'll just have a look at the voltages. So I'll power it on, and pin 28 on the SID now gives us 9.1 volts, which is correct. And if we switch over to AC, the user port is showing 10 volts AC. So that at least fixes the power supply. Let's see if it actually powers on. Okay, moment of truth. Oh, still a black screen. Let's just pull out the SID chip. Maybe that was preventing it from booting. Nope. Still a black screen. So once again, I'm just going to go through and quickly clean out these sockets just to make sure there's not a bad contact somewhere, and also clean the pins on these ICs. But if that doesn't work, then I think we'll have to move into some more deeper troubleshooting, which we'll have to cover in a future video. I have recently launched a Patreon, and I would like to thank the patrons that have already signed up. Thank you very much for your support, especially the people that you see on the screen right now. But every little bit counts, so please consider supporting the channel. It would be greatly appreciated, and yeah, gives me the motivation, and also hopefully one day will give me more time to actually put out more videos. So thank you very much. Let's see if this works with a clean socket and clean legs. No, nada. So I think we're going to have to leave it here. This looks like it's going to be a job for the dead test and diagnostic cartridge. So until then, thank you very much for watching. Be sure to stick around, because yes, we will look at some more advanced troubleshooting in the near future. As always, thanks for watching the Retro Channel. Bye. Just try this out. Okay, well, the dead test should be fun. Stay tuned for that.